So hi, welcome to week 4, the last section about the American West. We're going to again do the questions, consequences, narrative account, and the importance of. So here are the consequences questions on this last particular topic about conflict and tension, and we're going to focus on these. So the Battle of Little Bighorn, the Wounded Knee Massacre, the Reservation System, and the Dawes Act. So first up, the Battle of Little Bighorn. So remember, that was General Custer there in our picture. So there's a number of consequences of this. First of all, it was a change in white attitudes. Before this battle, the majority of white people wanted agreement with the Indians, some kind of negotiated settlement. After the total defeat of Custer, people were quite shocked and they wanted to destroy the Indian way of life. There was also an impact on the US Army. Quite a number of people died, but it was the nature of, they were disfigured, they were scalped. This proved quite shocking to the US Army. They wanted some form of revenge. So logically, they strengthened the military. They built a series of new forts and reinforced massively with the train, really bulked up the US Army in the West. The impact on the Indians themselves was obviously Crazy Horse and Sitting Bull became targets, were captured, and eventually were both killed. And any Indians who were kind of wandering around were rounded up and moved onto the reservations, and they were forced to give up their weapons. So it's a fairly straightforward question. Let's go to the second one. So Wounded Knee. So this all started from something called the ghost dance. So it's quite a sad kind of tale where they believed if they danced, the buffalo would return, the whites would leave, etc., etc. So a bit of a kind of end of world kind of scenario for them. So it all kind of happened when a place called Wounded Knee, where a group of Indians were settled, and there's rumours that they were going to start ghost dancing. This unnerved the surrounding American soldiers, who basically opened fire with cannon and rifles. So it's pretty horrendous event. However, the consequences of it it proved the end of Sioux resistance against the US Army. It led to the end of the ghost dance, which was banned, and literally of the Indian frontiers, the end of this whole chapter of American history. Whites felt justified about their need to exterminate hostile Indians, and in the longer term, it became a symbol of oppression for Indian civil rights going forward. So really, this is the last page of the whole story. It's quite a sad affair. Okay, the big question about the reservation system. So what were the consequences of this? Well, there was a deliberate intent to weaken the power of the chiefs. So after 1871, chiefs were no longer allowed to sign treaties. Also, on the reservation, most of the main decisions were taken either by the Indian agents or by the council, so they deliberately excluded the power of the chief. And instead of the chief controlling justice, any crimes were judged and punished in US courts. Children were taken away, often sent to boarding school to try and break away from the Indian culture. They were taught English, lost contact with their own languages, and faced traditional punishments. Thirdly, hunting. Obviously, they're not allowed to go hunting anymore, so they kind of ruptured the social structure. What were men supposed to do? They began to adopt Western clothing, and over time, gradually, the Indian culture was diluted. Dances were banned. Medicine men had their power reduced, although they still existed, and obviously the spread of Christianity onto the reservation. And with no horses, no weapons, and a lack of reluctance to kind of learn new skills like farming, they really lost the skills, their traditional hunting skills that they'd kind of honed over kind of hundreds of years. The Dawes Act. Now, the easiest way to remember this is it's very similar to the Homestead Act, but really for Indians. So the logic behind this from Washington was Indians had to assimilate or die. So either become like us or, die. So effectively, Indians were given 160 acres, same as the Homestead Act, and they were sort of told to go off and farm it. Now, the consequence of this was just a pure mathematical thing. half of the land was given to whites, because obviously 160 acres for each Indian. The Indians controlled a much wider area, so effectively that gave half of the Indian land to the whites. The Indians were not successful at farming. They didn't have the skills, the money for the equipment, and often the land they were given was of the poorest quality in the area or the territory where they lived. What happened quite often is they were taken advantage of, and they were offered money to sell their land quite cheaply, and so often they ended up homeless, or they were cheated out of their land by the whites, offering them alcohol or something cheap, and then they'd sign the land documents over to the whites. Okay, the narrative account question. So again, this is really, really tricky question. So this is going to be about analysing change in the law and order. And again, they will often give you two things. So in this case, the gold rush and the end of the Civil War. So I'm just going to briefly walk through this. So remember, what we're trying to do is tell the story about what happened, and ideally try and link each paragraph together. So in 1849, the gold rush in California, massive boom in population, mining towns, no law and order. So they eventually led to vigilantes and them taking care of their own issues there and there. By 1852, there was a famine in China, and over 300,000 Chinese moved into America for work, mainly on the railroads, but often mining gold. Because they worked together, they were very successful, and they often suffered a lot of racist attacks. 1865, end of the Civil War. Lots of guns. People were very used to guns. People wanted a new start in the West. Often people were traumatized, lost their family, their homes, etc., etc. So were kind of immune to normal human emotional behaviour. So killings and murders were quite common. 1869, the railroad was built. This led to cow towns and gambling, prostitution, all those kind of things that happen in places like Abilene. Sheriffs were often in the pocket of the people who owned the town, the corrupt people in the town, and it's quite difficult to recruit sheriffs because the pay was low, etc. So really companies had to resort to the private companies like the Pinkertons, who could use the railroad to transport law and order around areas. The last one on here is 1878 to 1886, with things like the Lincoln County War, so something that Billy the Kid was involved with. So this is an example in New Mexico of lack of law and order. The sheriff there was in the pocket of the house, the Irish Mafia, and this led for a tit-for-tat killing. And also in the OK Corral was an example of, obviously, a sheriff there was in the pocket of, well, sorry, not in the pocket of, was using their position of power to gain advantage over others, and it led to the infamous shooting at the OK Corral. So there's a huge amount in that. Last but not least, we're going to look at one of the exampled favourites, my ultimate hatred, the Johnson County War. Okay, so I'm not quite sure what they're going to ask here, but let's look at the narrative or the backstory. So this is set in Wyoming in the 1870s. And cattle ranches were booming, and a handful of very wealthy and very powerful ranchers were taking control of this state. By 1866, there was a really harsh winter, minus 55 in some areas. They lost a lot of cattle, a lot of money, and they blamed a lot of the smaller homesteaders and the smaller ranchers for stealing and rustling their cattle. So it was at the beginning of the tension between the two groups. By 1884, homesteaders had fenced off a huge amount of land, and they were unhappy with the political power of the ranchers, who had a lot of the senators and the politicians in their pocket. And the ranchers were unhappy that obviously the juries are made up of the local population. Juries rarely convicted people of rustling in Johnson County because most of the juries were either small homesteaders and were fed up with the power of the ranchers. So it kind of led to a boil in 1892. Two homesteaders called Ella Watson and Jim Averill, who were suspected of rustling, and probably did, were killed by the ranchers, and this kick-started an invasion. So what happened here was the WGSA, the WSGA, the Wyoming Stock Growers Association, hired effectively 22 hitmen to go in and kill as many homesteaders and rustlers as possible. So this is a really good example of how lawless the West was, where, one, it's quite recent, 1892, it's not that long ago. People could just hire hitmen willy-nilly and go in and kill other people. What happened was they were held up on a ranch, and eventually They were surrounded by the local homesteaders, and the sheriffs came in. They were arrested. So all those people in the photo there are the hitmen. So why is this important? It's important because it's an example of the law and how the WSGA, the ranchers, could afford hitmen and afford the best lawyers. Eventually they got the trial of the invaders moved to another county, which favoured the ranchers. Also, it shows us the state of the government in Wyoming, and basically how much the politicians were in the pocket of the rich and powerful ranchers, and eventually the invaders were set free. And thirdly, it shows to us the power of vigilantism, can't say that word, or vigilantes, and prove that actually people felt the need to take control rather than relying on the law, and eventually it marked the end of and the decline of the ranchers as a whole.